Resuming debate?
Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Resuming Debate. So Ottawa's been abuzz with this scandal involving foreign interference, a lot of allegations flying around. And from my perspective, this isn't a news story, but it's been a news story because there's been some new revelations that have been interesting and I think gotten a lot more attention to it. So to shed some light on what's going on, I'm very pleased that we're joined for the full hour today by Professor Christian Leuprecht, who's going through his CV would probably take too long. He's a professor at Queen's. He's with the Macdonald Laurier Institute. I last saw him when he testified before the Canada-China Committee, a trusted voice and an expert on many issues involving foreign policy and national security, but in particular on foreign interference. So, Christian, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Great. Well, so let's just dive right into this whole issue. So I assume most of our listeners have been following the foreign interference story scandal. Let's kind of start with the origin of it, which is leaks from CSIS. And this is kind of an interesting story in and of itself, that CSIS is leaking information to the press. There was an op-ed written in the Globe and Mail by the person doing the leak, kind of providing some explanation for what they're doing. This is serious stuff, because those that are sharing this information are risking criminal prosecution by sharing that information, but nonetheless it felt that there was an imperative to do so, and of course hiding their name in the process. What was your reaction to the fact that these leaks are happening, and what that may tell us about what our intelligence agencies are thinking?
Allow me to take a step back, because we're talking about foreign interference, and I think we have a challenge of how we actually parse the language here. Because foreign interference is sort of a broad term for all sorts of efforts by other state and non-state actors, for instance, to leverage diaspora communities or otherwise sort of interfere in our political process. What we're really talking about here is subversion. So that is to say, not just another state or non-state actor instrumentalizing, leveraging individuals, communities, trying to interfere in and influence policy processes, but quite deliberately undermining our political, economic, social, educational institutions for the purpose of weakening our society, of weakening our economy, of dividing people, of making this country less governable. And so I think actually this broad term that we've been using of foreign interference may not be helpful, because you can see that these are two fundamentally different problems. Inherently, in a diverse society such as Canada's, there's bound to be foreign interference, various communities that have diaspora links and so forth. And that's a long established challenge that Canada has had for decades. Is something we've learned to live with, but by and large, those actors know where to draw the line. So they might bring out people to, and these are actual real historic examples, these are not hypotheticals, where certain diaspora communities will mobilize to support a particular candidate that is putting her or his name forward in a riding to be able to get the nomination to then run for office. But these are all, for instance, individuals who are citizens, or perhaps at a minimum have permanent residency here and so forth. What we're talking about here is the prospect of a hostile foreign state actor breaking Canadian law in order actively to undermine our way of life, our democratic institutions, and our economy. And I think this is really important in the context of whoever is leaking the assessments that are being reported on.
Yeah, can I just jump in on that introduction, because I want to come back to this the CSIS leaks issue, but I do think it's actually a good place to start to talk about some of these distinctions in terms of what foreign states may try to do on Canadian soil. There are things that we clearly know are acceptable and reasonable, and that would be kind of run-of-the-mill advocacy, right? So if the Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister is down in the United States, does an interview on an American network and says, our view is this, that, or the other thing, sort of public advocacy for Canada's position and Canada's interest, that's not foreign interference. That's part of democratic debate, and ministers from other countries might do the same here in Canada. We might have, as we have had, members of parliament from foreign countries testify before Canadian parliamentary committees suggesting we adopt some kind of policy or another. The case that's clearly unacceptable is when laws are being broken in the process, right? So if a foreign entity is doing activity that would otherwise be illegal for anyone to do, that might be somebody threatening someone here in Canada, breaking election law, that's clearly out. I guess there might be a middle case of something that someone who's a Canadian could do, but a foreign actor or foreign diplomat isn't supposed to be doing, participating in Canadian elections, for example, in ways that would otherwise be within the bounds of the law, would be probably unacceptable if it involved a foreign diplomat trying to influence people to vote for a nomination candidate or something. And this is also different from Canadian citizens who have concerns about issues abroad that are involved in Canadian politics advocating those issues, right? If somebody happens to be supportive of a foreign state as a matter of personal conviction and conscience, they might advocate for those policies in Canadian democracy, whether they're part of a diaspora community or not. So how can we parse out these distinctions, especially in that kind of middle case where someone's not violating the law, but they're doing something that's inappropriate for a representative of a foreign actor?
Right. So there's, of course, normal democratic activity where people will voice their views, and where even some foreigners might voice their views with regards to Canadian policy. I would say that middle ground is what we often refer to subterfuge. So that is to say, activities they may be illegal, they may not necessarily be criminal, they may not necessarily be illegal, but the intent behind it is clearly nefarious intent. The problem is that the legislation we have, not just in Canada, this is a broad sort of ally problem, but it is a particular problem in Canada because we have not updated either our legislative instruments nor our intelligence and law enforcement institutions and the way we assign them their powers to deal effectively with this problem, is that because this activity is sort of nebulous but nefarious, it's very difficult to call people out for it, let alone to have a sensible security intelligence, let alone a criminal intelligence investigation. So this is why some of these proposals that are on the table, for instance, none of which, of course, are silver bullet, but for instance, the foreign agent registry. What it effectively does is it lowers the threshold for prosecution or for simply telling a diplomat that the activities that you're engaged in are in clear violation of the status that you hold in Canada, for instance. So it's a way of drawing red lines. And this, of course, much of what legislation does. Legislation is there to be able to draw lines and send a signal of what is and is not acceptable. But the problem is criminal conduct has a very high threshold, both evidentiary threshold as well as sort of a high threshold in terms of transgressing it. And so what we need to do in order to contain and deter some of the subterfuge activity is to create a framework that on the one hand sends clear signals and on the other hand allows security intelligence and law enforcement to engage in prosecutions of activities where we now have other mechanisms to say what you're doing is not acceptable in this country or for the purposes for which you're engaging in this type of activity. And that, I think, is really much of the conversation that we're trying to have here. One is sort of, yes, the activities of foreign interference, the activities of subversion, but then if we know that we've had, at least going back to 1995, subterfuge activity by a hostile state actor in this country, and we are here 28 years later still talking about it and still talking about what to do about it, that suggests to me we have a significant deficit in protecting our democratic institutions and our democratic process.
Could you give a very specific example of some kind of activity that fits in this space of nebulous, nefarious, not necessarily criminal, but certainly something we would not want foreign actors to be doing. That's kind of that middle case again between clearly illegal activity, clearly legitimate activity. What's something that specific that someone has done or could do that would fit in that space?
Well, on any university campus in this country, talk to Hong Kong democracy activists, Tibetan activists, Uyghur activists, or mainland China sort of activists who are advocating for reforms on mainland China. When they have meetings, when they have public meetings, when they have demonstrations, the pushback that they encounter. And so we know, for instance, that one of the activities that the United Front Work Department, so China's effectively overseas foreign interference mechanism, engages in is it has the contacts for a whole host of individuals, often international students, not necessarily out of their own volition, that they will simply text and say, there's an activity here, we need you to show up, and we need you to run counter to that activity. So you'll see posters being torn down, you'll see people being shouted down. So, not necessarily illegal or criminal type of activity, but it's surprising when you all of a sudden see, so you might remember, for instance, so here's another fine example. You might remember when Meng Wanzhou was arrested, and we had sort of these 12 protesters out with placards demonstrating against her arrest. And a very smart journalist started digging and discovered that these were individuals who were recruited on university campuses, having no idea what they were being recruited for, being given some money and being told, stand here with this placard. So okay. These are the sort of types of activities that are clearly intended to influence public, at a minimum, influence public perception, but also meant to constrain or influence decision-making, and are more broadly intended to constrain or influence strategic behavior by Canada, either, for instance, by thwarting government from implementing measures that might contain this type of activity, or by putting a chilling effect on countries such as Canada taking measures that might run counter to the interests of a hostile state.
Okay, so I guess the picture you're painting in those situations, and it applies to the scandal involving nominations as well, which we'll get to. But essentially, it's sort of political mobilization of people who a foreign embassy has some sway over, with sort of the implication of potential threats or negative or positive consequences. So if exchange students from China are told by the Chinese embassy, do this, with the implication that your status or your family's position might be impacted if you didn't do it, that kind of implied pressure leading to protest activities, that's a form of foreign interference, and it certainly wouldn't be illegal for those students to go and protest of their own volition, but it's a problem when they're being told to or coordinated in that activity by a foreign embassy.
Right, because if you're an international student and you're effectively being coerced by a foreign state or non-state actor, for that matter, to engage in particular activity, then that is clearly illegal in terms of that it effectively constitutes threats, harassment, and so forth, right, that otherwise, if it would happen domestically, if I did that to you, you would probably go to the local police detachment and report me for trying to harass, to threaten, to extort you, or so forth. But of course, when you're an international student, you're on a status here, and you have family back home,
right?
Or you might be an international student. So sort of another sort of nice example. So we have a case like this from Australia, international students who are being told, okay, open a bank account, and there's going to be money flowing through that account. Don't ask any questions about where the money comes from or where the money is going. Right? So we're leveraging your ability here, or another example, for instance, people who are being told to live in a particular house here. Make this house look occupied. You can live here. When we tell you to leave, you're going to have to leave, right? So this is sort of how we engage in sort of laundering value from offshore through Canadian shores. But then
Yeah,
to
and some of
boot, we
that
might.
some of that activity may be illegal on its own, but I see the point about challenging to beat evidentiary thresholds. There's clearly some interference going on, but you can if you can't legally challenge that interference directly, it can be hard to establish a case of threats or intimidation when a lot of this may be just by implication, right, as opposed to by kind of explicit threat making.
Yeah, so we're trying to lower the threshold
Yeah.
for state authorities to engage in this, to engage with this type of activity. But we also have to remember we have a federal police force that has significant challenges. One of them being that it spends 85% of its time and resources doing contract, territorial, local, and Indigenous policing.
Yeah.
So if we have a lot of distractions on the federal side, plus we have a very high evidentiary threshold in order to engage in this activity because we haven't modernized our legislative toolkit, we might not be surprised why in decades we haven't seen any prosecution that I'm aware of for this type of activity in this country.
Right. So I guess on the question of to what extent this is a law problem and to what extent this is an enforcement problem, it's again kind of in that space between there where there's some legal gaps that make the enforcement very difficult. But let me come back to the question I started off with and you were sort of getting to when I jumped in, which is, so we've got the RCMP. RCMP has lots of different responsibilities and, there's questions around enforcement. Now we have leaks coming out of CSIS, our spy agency. So what does it tell you about this whole story that we have leaks coming out of CSIS?
So let's first distinguish between what the RCMP and CSIS do, because I don't think this is always clear in people's minds. So the RCMP engages in criminal intelligence. So ultimately, the objective is to be able to prosecute someone. No point in running an investigation if you don't think you can prosecute. And there's two reasons to prosecute. One is you believe a crime may have been committed. The other is that there is public interest to prosecute. So those are sort of the two thresholds. What we're talking about here is security intelligence. And so security intelligence has a much lower threshold in order to engage in activities. And security intelligence, as opposed to independent, ostensibly politically independent investigations, that's sort of a separate conversation we can have, that security intelligence, by intent in all countries, reports directly to the executive and to the minister, because it is intended to give the government of the day an appreciation of the threat environment and how to engage with that threat environment. Now in Canada, we kind of have one eye blind, unlike all of our other G6 partners, because in Canada we have a domestic security intelligence agency that under Section 12 has some very limited foreign mandates, but we do not have a foreign human collection agency. We have a foreign signals intelligence agency that is the Communication Security Establishment, but unlike our other major allies, we don't have a human or other data type other than signals intelligence collection agency. So that means we're blind on one eye. So when we kind of see things, we basically need to go to our allies and kind of help us try to replicate that or try to figure out what's going on. That's not entirely accurate under Section 12, but that's sort of part of the challenge. So what we've seen is allegedly assessments, so not raw intelligence, but assessments of that intelligence, because agencies always loathe to share raw intelligence because it's always subject to interpretation, and you need it's a considerable skill set to interpret that. Some aspects of assessments and some reports of assessments being leaked. Now, it's not entirely clear where those reports originate, nor should we draw the inference that the leaker is necessarily someone from within CSIS or even the security intelligence community. So there's a broad question to be asked about who that individual is and what their motivations are, because clearly the person who's doing the leaking is prepared to take immense risks. Under the Security of Information Act, this individual and anybody who willingly or unwillingly aids or abets them faces very serious jail time in this country. In addition, there's of course the prospect that these types of leaks can bring down a government. So it in itself could be a form of interference in the democratic process. The problem is these documents were never written for public consumption. When you write an intelligence assessment, there are classified versions. And then if you look on the CSIS website, for instance, you have the unclassified annual report. So the way they're written was never meant for sort of public consumption. And then you have the problem that, of course, these leaks are quite injurious to Canada's national security, both in terms of the relatively uncontrolled divulging of classified information, and of course of our allies who are looking at Canada and going, oh boy, these folks have a leaky ship. Can we trust them can we trust Canada to keep the intelligence that we're sharing, the assessments that we're sharing within sort of close confines? You remember that at the beginning of the Trump era, this was sort of a concern that all of a sudden assessments that other countries and intelligence were providing to the United States were finding, parts of which were finding their ways out into the open. And we didn't then have that problem throughout the administration. So I think somebody had an adult conversation with everybody in the room and told them that these types of leaks can be extremely problematic for the community as a whole and for the country in particular. So all that to say is the leaks that we're seeing come with immense risk. And I'm not entirely sure the leaker has calculated all the risks and the trade-offs that come with the leaks that are being presented. At the same time, I think we would be not well served taking into consideration the risks that this individual faces and the lengths to which they're going to go, not to take very serious the motives and the intent behind these leaks. Because on the one hand, when we've seen these in the United States, in the Australia and the United Kingdom, it turned out afterwards there was always a serious grain of truth to what was being leaked once we started looking into the allegations. And that I think writing this individual off as disgruntled, writing it off, we only have these little snippets of evidence, we can't triangulate it or so. As I say, history tells us when we've seen these elsewhere, it's turned out that this was always the beginning of a much bigger story.
Yeah, that's a fascinating perspective. Maybe just to summarize and make sure that I've understood right. So basically, the RCMP conducts investigations in order to prosecute, right? And they make those decisions independently of government. But CSIS has, in a way, a much more dependent relationship on the government of the day because they gather security intelligence, which then they use to inform policymakers. And policymakers can choose to use that or not use it as they like. And the nature of security information is that there's not a huge amount of accountability involved in that because for the most part, whether they fail to act on things they should have acted on or didn't use the information correctly, that will be shielded from the public eye for at least a very long time, right? So this seems to project the kind of frustration from elements or maybe more than elements of CSIS that maybe the information is not being used in a certain way, and at the same time we need to take seriously the potential negatives and risks associated with leaking. So that should concern us, the potential negatives. But on the other hand, it should be a really kind of a red flag for us that in spite of those risks, in spite of those downsides, the person looking at the information felt that the upsides outweighed the downsides.
So yeah, this relationship between security intelligence and political executives in democracy is a long-standing frayed relationship. Mm-hmm. Because we know that not just in Canada, but in many democracies, governments of the day either don't heed the assessments or the advice that they are getting, or, of course, if you look, for instance, at the Iraq invasion, sometimes the political executive will go to intelligence and basically have them write a first-year undergraduate paper telling them to kind of reconstruct the evidence so you get sort of the outcome that you're tautologically that you're looking for. So necessarily but in a democracy, we also have to remember we're not electing security intelligence agencies or officials. We're electing a government of the day to exercise its best judgment in the national interest and in the interests of the people, with the legitimacy and constitutional rule of law legitimacy, to make its judgment.
Right.
And ultimately, it'll be up to, in an election, the electorate can pass, among other things, judgment on whether they feel that the government overall served them well or not. So it's it's always a bit tricky when any civil servant, let alone somebody in the security intelligence community, takes it upon themselves and effectively decides that the policy making by government fundamentally runs so counter to their own predisposition that they need to go public. And I mean, right. Snowden is a good example of this, right? So that Snowden clearly felt that what was happening was unacceptable, Edward Snowden. What was happening and what he was seeing within the NSA was, in his view, unacceptable. He did not exploit the many levels that he would have had to be able to bring to other people's attention to the transparency and accountability mechanisms. And he subsequently made decisions that were highly injurious, not just to the United States, but I would say to the safety and security of the United States' closest allies and partners, including Canada. And of course, he now faces very serious criminal prosecution should he decide to return to the United States. So these personal convictions may not always be in the best judgment for that particular situation or that particular circumstance. Yeah. At the same time, I would say in Canada, we now have a reputational problem with our allies. And that reputational problem dates back as far as the 1990s. Given that the problem of foreign interference, subterfuge, and subversion has now been documented, at least in public record, for at least 30 years, has been triangulated by various means. And then we have issues such as, without going into the pros and cons and merits and debates around what happened with the Ottawa convoy in February 2022, certainly there was a lot of bewilderment among allies and especially among allied law enforcement and intelligence agency about what in the world is going on in Canada. Yeah. And so we've had these sort of this years of, if you'll permit the pun, Chinese water torture here in Canada, and we are now suffering increasing reputational damage as a country with our allies as a result of at least perceived inaction and failure, coordination, collective action problems within and beyond our national security community.
Mm-hmm. Can I just seize on one thing you said? You talked a bit earlier in your response about the problem of kind of the relationship between the democratically elected leaders who are non-experts and the security experts who are advising them. And I guess those who watch the British show Yes Minister will be familiar with this kind of tension in principle, but it seems to take on a particular dimension in the context of security agencies where especially on sensitive national security issues, democracies should be led by democratic leaders. But on the other hand, the structural problem is, if we have foreign interference that, take the party names out of it, but, Party A and Party B are competing in elections, and you have foreign interference that is aimed at helping Party A win elections. Party A is in government, gets advised by security intelligence agencies, hey, this foreign element is helping you, Party A, win elections. Party A does not have an incentive to solve that problem. If anything, they have an incentive to allow that problem to get worse because they are benefiting from that problem, even if it's not in the national interest. And nobody knows that this is all going on because they don't have any interest in talking about it. So the structural problem is, if foreign interference is about hurting the whole country in obvious ways, then any political actor has an incentive to try to deal with it. But if the purpose of foreign interference in a particular case is to help the party in power win elections over the party in opposition, then the party in power just doesn't have an incentive to address it. Do you see that as a structural problem, and is there a way to fix that structural problem?
So it's a great question, because it's a classic problem in public administration, right? So generally, when sort of policy sort of appears to be going off the rails, we tend to say in public administration, never ascribe to malicious intent what you can ascribe to ineptitude, and never ascribe to ineptitude what you can simply ascribe to people being preoccupied. So there's limited bandwidth in any government, and so part of these issues, governments set policy priorities, and the government might decide this is not our policy priority. We don't want to talk about it. There's only, we've got however many years, we've got 4 years to be in government or whatever. There's about 5 things that we can realistically get done in these 4 years. Here's those 5 things. These other things, regardless of what happens, doesn't interest us. We're just going to leave it aside. I'm not saying that that's sort of what's happening, but it's all to say is that there's multifaceted explanations for what might be going on. The problem is, of course, always perception. That if there is a perception that a political individual, a political party, or a government is potentially leveraging circumstances that may involve problematic dealings by a foreign state or non-state actor, possibly illegal dealings, and possibly criminal dealings for its own advantage, that will inherently then delegitimize the democratic and the electoral process. So I think there's a fine judgment here to be exercised by government of the day to ensure that accountability, transparency, and legitimacy is served in the eyes of a public that often, of course, has a rather inchoate understanding of how government works, because the perception is generally that government doesn't work, even though by and large government works sort of reasonably well, in part because we tend to have very competent civil servants that keep governments out of trouble rather than the perception that they get governments into trouble. And even more less coy understanding of everything that involves national security, intelligence, and so forth, because it's sort of this black box. We don't talk about it much. And everybody thinks that they're an expert on healthcare or on education because we've all been to the doctor and we've all been to school, right? So we've all experienced this in conversations with our friends and family. But when you talk about intelligence and national security, people kind of stand back and go, "Oh, that's really complex. That's really difficult." And it turns out it's not just the people who stand back; it's many of the politicians who stand back who go, "Oh, this is kind of tricky. I don't know much about this. I'm just going to hang back here and let the experts sort of look after this." Right. And this is part of the problem that we have in the 21st century. It's a very complex security environment, not just internationally, but domestically. And so what is the appropriate relationship in terms of expert agencies of the government advising the government, and what involvement do we need by government in those conversations to make sure that those expert agencies can actually take the actions that are necessary and appropriate to ensure the legitimacy of our democratic institutions?
Yeah. Look, it's a significant challenge, right? All these tensions you're talking about, right? And they echo sort of larger issues in public administration. But as I said, I think they have a particular significance in this area where the information is harder to understand generally, and so much of it is not accessible. And it does seem to me as well that the government sometimes says, "Well, we can't talk about that officially because of secrecy requirements," but the actual reason may just be because it's politically inconvenient for them to talk about it. And it's hard to know, right? So I guess it seems like in this whole dynamic of there being this problem, it festering for a long time, uh, uh, the government maybe not making this issue a priority because of some calculations around what they consider to be priorities, or some self-interest calculations. All of these things are possible, and within that dynamic, you have someone at CSIS saying, I think it's in the national interest for me to cut through all this and follow my conscience, even if that breaks the rules formally. And this brings us to where we are right now, right?
Right. I mean, every civil servant, I mean, my regular day job is at the Royal Military College, where I have the unique distinction of being not just a tenured professor, but also civil servant. So we swear loyalty and allegiance to the crown, that is to say, the government of the day, and to serve that government with the best possible advice that we can provide. Now, government might not always like that
Yeah.
advice, and whether they take it or not, that's our previous conversation. That's up to them ultimately. But anytime you have a civil servant deciding that they need to editorialize, that inherently becomes problematic. So you can think about that. This is clearly an individual who has convictions, but also an individual who feels quite strongly, obviously, that the way all these pieces fit together is that this requires attention that it hasn't received, and that they believe that they are acting in the national interest, and so they're putting that national interest above sort of the allegiance and the loyalty that that they have sworn. And so this is partially why I think we need. I think this is part of the problem with the broader conversations that we're having, because I'm not sure, and with no prejudice to yourself or any of your colleagues, that Canadians really trust any of their politicians on this particular issue, because it's highly partisan, it's highly polarized, and it's impossible for them to replicate any of the information that's out there or to triangulate it. And so this is sort of why I think it's very important for governments to demonstrate the independence of reestablishing the legitimacy of the process. And so that's why I, for instance, think there's a, I think many of us who study intelligence felt it would have been very important for government of the day to come out from the beginning and to say very clearly, the leaks are not acceptable. They have to stop, and the reporting has to stop. If you have concerns, there are appropriate ways within your democracy to address those concerns. At the same time, now that we have these things out there, we need to reassure the Canadian public that everything is proper, appropriate, legal, legitimate, and there's nobody's having an undue benefit from some hostile state actor or and so forth. And the problem is, with the announcements that we've seen, they don't really meet that threshold.
Yeah.
So
what you're saying is, in an environment where there's clearly a problem with foreign interference, there's clearly a problem with sort of the context in which this information has been brought to our attention, and there is partisan debate about this, and that's legitimate. I mean, members of parliament are going to reflect their particular party perspective, but there is a need to kind of reassert the independent pole of this discussion. And I know you're on the record saying the best way to do that is through an independent public inquiry, correct?
Well, I think there's other mechanisms available to us. So yes, I think an inquiry is going to be needed. I think we need to have a debate on what that inquiry is going to be about. Is it about foreign interference? Is it about subversion? Is it about subterfuge? Is it about all those things? Is it about none of those things? The problem is, look at how long, for instance, the Cullen Commission on Money Laundering, British Columbia took. Look at sort of how long the Rouleau inquiry, the Emergencies Act inquiry took. This is going to be a much more complex problem. So we're going to need to have some resolution on this before the next election, and an inquiry is not going to get us there in that time. So there are other mechanisms available to the government of the day. So this is a government that instituted new mechanism for intelligence accountability and transparency. The National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians is one of those mechanisms. It is a committee of parliamentarians, not a parliamentary committee, and you would appreciate that nuance. Most of the listeners might not. A committee of parliamentarians reports to the political executive of the day.
Yeah.
A parliamentary committee reports to Parliament. So that means the NSICOG, even though it's made up of parliamentarians, ultimately issues its report to the political executive of the day, which can decide whether it releases that report, which part of that report it might release, and it controls the timeline on which it releases that report. And I think here would have been a nice opportunity for the government to say, well, actually, on this issue only, we will trust the parliamentarians on this committee to exercise their best judgment in arriving at a report that they can then deliver to Parliament, and where they decide, and they can generate two reports if they want, one for the executive, one for Parliament, but where they decide what does the public need to know, and they also decide the timeline on which they generate that report and on which they table that report in Parliament. The other would have been, okay, so the Prime Minister decided to have a special rapporteur. Without weighing the pros and cons of this, we could have ensured, and I thought that was the delay in announcing the name, that the Prime Minister was talking to the opposition leaders to make sure that when there is an announcement, everybody can be on the same page and say, we support this announcement, we believe that this is a distinguished person, this is the right person, we agree with the terms of reference, and we agree roughly with the timeline and the objectives of this rapporteur. So, so I think that we could probably think of other mechanisms that are available to a government of the day. But all that to say is that I think there were a number of missed opportunities here on accountability, transparency, and legitimacy, other than having this zero-sum conversation about a public inquiry or no public inquiry that could have gotten us at least some of the way of where I think this conversation needs to go, primarily to reassure the electorate.
Yeah. Yeah, those are interesting points. I mean, I would underline, there are big challenges with NSICOP. It is, as you say, a committee of parliamentarians, not a parliamentary committee. It has limitations that relate to that. It can only report directly to the executive. The other issue, though, with NSICOP is that it has repeatedly published reports already saying there are problems with foreign interference, right? Like it has been sounding the alarm, and nothing's been done on this for 4 years. So it is interesting to me when people talk about NSICOP studying foreign interference. I mean, they already are, they already have, and we have we've seen the public reports that they have been allowed to release, because the reports all go through the executive. And I was just thinking as you're talking as well, there are instances where, for a public inquiry, for some whatever advisory mechanism, where governments have been intentional about incorporating perspectives that are clearly unimpeachable in terms of genuine neutrality, right? Or they even go further and get someone that has a background with one of the other parties in order to get that credibility. I know a number of times the Harper government engaged John Manley. They appointed former NDP premier as our ambassador in Washington. The Liberal government, with regard to their renegotiation of NAFTA, although I didn't agree with where they ended up in certain respects, they were able to, I think, establish more credibility in the process by having prominent conservatives as part of their advisory body. Why do you think the government didn't do that in this case? Like, why didn't they really make the effort to build some process of inquiry, independent investigation that had general independence and legitimacy? Why do they seem to be trying to manage this process with people that they consider credible, but that don't have the sort of cross-party credibility?
I am puzzled. I'm honestly puzzled. To me, one possible choice would have been, there's a half dozen judges around Ottawa, for instance, that have national security clearances. There's one particular judge that has tried most of our terrorism trials, for instance. So they're independent people with extensive experience in national security around. There's people who have former federal judge that has extensive experience with the former Office of the Commissioner of the Security Communications Establishment, people who have experience with the former CIRC, the Security Intelligence Review Committee. So, these might not be household names, but I think they're individuals who have considerable familiarity with the way national security intelligence works, with the way you use intelligence, with the way you hold agencies accountable, and so forth. So to me, probably, so this is a bit like a special rapporteur with no particular expertise in national intelligence is sort of like appointing a minister, right? So ministers in the Westminster system are usually people who don't come with subject matter expertise, and we deliberately don't want people with subject matter expertise so they can sort of parse the advice that they're getting from civil servants and from stakeholders and whatnot, and sort of arrive through the wisdom of crowds sort of at their best judgment. But I think this issue is so sensitive and so particular that I'm not sure that arriving at a best judgment under broad democratic principles meets the bar for the considerable challenge and the complexity of the issues before us.
Yeah. Yeah, no, so I think you've shed light on this very well, just the value of having some kind of genuinely independent investigative process. And, the fact that appointing another person to consider this who doesn't have intelligence expertise doesn't make much sense. And you mentioned the various people that could conduct an independent inquiry. I mean, would it kill the Prime Minister to get the leaders around the table and say, here's some of the names we're looking at, what do you think? And to say, we just want to get to the bottom of this. We actually want to uncover the information. But I'll just say politically, and maybe you want to comment on this, maybe you don't, but politically, the Prime Minister is making himself look guilty by not undertaking the kinds of actions that would look like seriously getting to the bottom of this, by kind of lashing around for excuses, and then like he's trying to manage the issue politically instead of actually trying to come to an honest assessment of what happened and help the public find that out as well.
So without passing judgment, I would have to think there are probably people in the political executive who, if they could wind back time, would likely do things differently today, would likely have done things differently a couple of months ago if they knew today what they know. Mm-hmm. So whether that's a function of political decisions, whether that's a function of decisions by political staff that maybe didn't have the best expertise and advice, or whether it's a function of a civil service that perhaps didn't provide the best advice, or whether that best advice was provided and wasn't taken, that's something that probably under cabinet confidence we will never know, and that Canadians will simply need to pass judgment on in the next election. But as you can gather from my remarks, and maybe the political executive for the Prime Minister decided he has different objectives. So what process you use is a function of what outputs and outcomes you want to generate. And my end game is legitimacy, transparency, accountability, in particular in the eyes of Canadians. Mm-hmm. But maybe the executive has decided they have a different outcome in mind. If it is, I haven't been able to ascertain what exactly that is. And I think at a minimum, it would be nice to know, if we're going to have all these mechanisms to look into something, what exactly is the point? What is it that we're trying to achieve? If we've been having these conversations for 30 years and we've known about this, so what are we going to do today that's actually different from what we've already done? And as you point out, the NISCOPS report from 2019 that's available, that was released in an unclassified version, or unclassified parts were released in 2020, that any of the listeners can download from the NISCOP website. So let's actually figure out what we're trying to do and then work backwards and figure out what are our options and the mechanisms we might want to take to achieve that particular objective. And I sometimes get the sort of impression that we're just doing stuff in order to do stuff rather than actually having in mind what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. Before we wrap up, I want to ask you one other question that's in sort of a completely different direction. This discussion has exposed a lot of concern about what the Communist Party out of Beijing is up to and their foreign interference operations. But it's also been a jumping off point for certain other folks to say there are other players and raise concerns about other actors. Besides the CCP issue, who are some of the other players involved in this kind of foreign interference, and does it complicate geopolitical relationships when some of these players are kind of not the obvious geopolitical adversaries?
Sure. I mean, so look at, for instance, one example. So resource development in Canada, where we know that we've had both influence operations run by entities associated with the Communist Party in China, but we've also had significant private sector money, for instance, from the United States, supporting various causes in Canada, ostensibly sort of on both sides of the policy issue. And so there are countries that have made simple judgments around this. So, for instance, in Australia, if you want to donate to a political party, you have to be a citizen. So there are some ways that you can sort of contain and curtail that space. Transparent reporting mechanisms about non-governmental organizations and the sources, for instance, of their funding, so that at least you can sort of ascertain the sources. So look, I mean, this is a government that if it wants to make change, it affects change very quickly. You'll remember during the Ottawa convoy, changes that I myself and colleagues had called for years in terms of legislative amendments when it comes to the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act, were enacted in a matter of weeks. I mean, in record time for Canadian legislative decision making. So there's clearly, or similarly, if you think about, for instance, the national security INSETs, the Integrated National Security Enforcement Teams, where every major city has these, and their primary task is as a counterterrorism and anti-terrorism sort of force. If we wanted to, as a government, there's nothing that stops us from saying, we're going to pull together a bunch of folks, and just like the way we've done for terrorism, we're going to resource some very effective mechanisms with one simple mandate, which is to go after subversion and subterfuge. We're not going to have time to change the laws, but you're going to have to work within what we got. So there's ways for government to signal that it takes these elements seriously. But I think the point of your question is, we always want to be geo-agnostic on these issues. Yeah. We never want to be fingering any one particular country, in part because the threat environment changes. And in the 21st century, the threat environment is going to change very quickly. Look at the last 25 years. Would anybody have been able to predict the way the threat environment really changed? So we want to posture ourselves in an agnostic way that is able to respond to a host of national security types of threats. And so having a robust national security system. And so, for instance, the challenges on intelligence have brought on major national security reforms to the national security community in Australia, in particular to the way assessments are done, as well as in the United Kingdom. In Australia, they're now basically every 5 years, there's a review of the national security community. People aren't always happy with what that review looks like. They don't necessarily like always what comes out of that review. But look, the last one was, I think, Richard's review was 1,600 pages. That's a good deal to go on if you want to know how we can innovate and how we can generate sort of reform. And I think that's the essence of sort of that the last time we had any sort of commission of the sort was the Macdonald Commission in 1981 that took security intelligence out of the RCMP and created CSIS. And I would say the world has changed a lot since the early 1980s. Maybe that alone is a good argument for a public inquiry, that we actually want to make sure that our national security system is fit for purpose, because I've, of course, argued for years that it is not.
Thank you so much for joining us for, I think, what's been a very rich conversation. The bottom line is, it seems we need to get to work. We're behind the 8 ball. There's a lot that needs to be done here. And thank you for shedding some light for all of our listeners on the important issues of foreign interference, giving some context to the headlines. Folks, if you enjoyed this conversation, we're out with new episodes every 2 weeks on Resuming Debate. You can find it on all of your podcast platforms. And we'll be back with another episode in 14 days. Thank you.